would rank them and say, okay, that's great, here's a couple of $100,000. That approach where the project comes from the school community up was clearly always going to get better value. And of course, from the government's point of view, if it turned out that it wasn't the best project in the world, well, the school community chose it. You know, it was their decision. It wasn't being imposed on them. Now, what's interesting about the government's approach is that that mechanism was in place. You know, the Federal Department of Education had been implementing that program for some years. They knew how it was done. It was simply a question of expanding it somewhat and continuing, therefore, with an approach that worked. But instead, no, who knows why, possibly because it was a liberal program, it was out the door, and the solutions, with all of the consequences we're very familiar with, came from top down. So that was a good example of a situation where, yes, the objective was, I think, clearly communicated, but the approach was not evidence-based, as Gary Banks would say, and it was not based on past experience, and it could readily have been so. So there are some thoughts on the government's travails. I hope you don't think they're too partisan, and if you do, you can tax me with my partisanship. So I'd be happy to take some questions. Thanks.
Edwin Trevor Roberts. Malcolm, thank you for your presentation. I just want to link the gist of your speech today with your introduction and just ask you, is Labor's supposed failings to date been a lack of social capital? Is Julia Gillard perhaps bowling alone?
Well, that's a good question. I think I'd like to take that one on notice. I don't know. I'm not sure whether that is her problems are a lack of engagement with the overall community. Certainly on the mining tax, that was clearly the case. You know, yeah. I mean, you may. I think that's probably a very keen insight, and I thank you for
it. Hi, Malcolm. Tony Holly. My son is a scholar at Sydney Grammar, as you were. If I was to pass on your advice from today in terms of making the career transitions that you've made, because to me they're fairly incredible transitions, you know, journalist, lawyer, you know, investment banker, etc., now politician. What would you say in terms of, you know, the path you've gone down and why you've managed to be successful where many others have been a lot less successful transitioning?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, that's very generous. I've had a few notorious setbacks. How old is your son? 14. What a great! I ought to be 14 again. Well, look, I would say to your son, read widely. Don't get too vocational in the sense of you know, becoming too fixated on one thing. The probability is that you will that he'll have many careers, different careers, rather than it's unlikely that he'll go and work for one business, you know, when he leaves school or university, and then, you know, retire with a gold watch at 65 or something. So I think reading widely. The best advice, given that he's at my old school, I would say the most important thing I would encourage him to do is to make sure that he studies Latin and Greek. I know that's a little, you probably think that's a bit eccentric.
Latin, French and Italian.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, but he should do Greek as well. And the reason, I'll tell you why I say that. You know, I think, you know, we spend a lot of, we get very focused on, you know, on North Asian languages naturally, particularly on Chinese, given China's rise to, you know, even greater greatness. And of course, you know, if your son was studying Chinese, you could say to him, "Nung li gong zo," which means, roughly speaking, work harder. But the North Asian languages are very hard to learn a lot of or much of at school. The good thing about Latin and Greek is that they are the two of the main building blocks of English. And so, you know, as Shakespeare said, a little Latin and less Greek is nonetheless quite helpful. So I think it's the argument for studying the classical languages, the best argument, I think, is that they give a good grounding, you know, of what is inevitably his and, you know, vast majority of Australian kids' mother tongue or first language.
Let me throw one in, Malcolm, on economics for you. What do you make of the productivity debate going on at the moment, particularly in relation to, we know that labour productivity is falling everywhere, but particularly in Australia, where we seem to have maximised the benefits which have come out of the Hawke-Keating era and the Howard Costello era, and we're basically writing off our terms of trade at the moment. So where do you sit about the problems with particularly labour productivity?
Well, I mean, I think the key thing is flexibility, and you know what the government has done is re-regulated the workplace, and that's one of the things that undermines labour productivity or diminishes the ability to be more productive. You know, the flexibility, the ability for employers and employees to devise new and more efficient ways of doing business is important. And I think you know, there's clearly got to be, you know, this is not a sort of a one-line answer, but the more flexible the labour market is, all other things being equal, the greater labour productivity you'll have. At the same time, you've got to have safety nets and protection and fairness, and getting that balance right is the challenge. But you know, the fact is, when Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd came into government, they reversed a process of reform that was not just a liberal, you know, they didn't just repeal work choices, they actually reversed a whole series of reforms of the previous Labor government as well.
And are there particular sectors? I mean, healthcare's banned, you know, but there,
Yeah.
I say it's not a leading question, but education.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to pick out particular sectors, but obviously the non-traded sectors are the ones that are most vulnerable. You know, in every economy around the world, it is the non-traded sectors that have the least pressure to be efficient. I mean, you know, this has always been an issue in Japan, for example. You know, their traded sectors, their export industries are incredibly efficient, but their non-traded sectors, service industries, for example, much less so. And so that's where you've got to make sure that you've got the flexibility in your labour practices, and right across. It's not just labour laws. I don't want you to think I'm solely focused on that. We've got to go through every area of government and really every area of our economy and ask ourselves, are there barriers to people doing what they want to do in their businesses, in their entrepreneurial activities? You know, it is extraordinary. Just think about how much of your dealings, for example, with financial institutions is now entirely electronic, and the answer is probably all of it. Compare that to your dealings with government. Now, why is that? You know, why is government still shoveling, you know, millions of tons of paper at the public, who then have to deal with it and send it back? Why aren't we being, you know, why do we keep talking about e-government but doing so little to realise it? And that is a genuine obstacle to productivity, greater productivity.
Nada Haxton. Malcolm, thank you for your wonderful speech. You used the word panic a number of times. What do you see as the foundation for that? expression in terms of your talk, and is this becoming a dominant political trend? Can you comment?
That's a very. I can't tell you, these questions just so good. This is another. This is. I can. There's an article there. The politics of panic. Look, I was using it about Rudd's reaction to the GFC, and I don't think there's any doubt that was panic. I mean, they, and you know, with the benefit of hindsight, and it's easy to say. I get they. You know, if you were to criticise me for this, you'd say, well, Malcolm, it's easy to say with 20/20 vision in hindsight. You know, would you? How can you be sure you wouldn't have done exactly what he'd done if you'd been in his job? I think there is a. I think in some ways, the media cycle. You know, we all live in this media world of instantaneous news, sensational. Everything is sensationalised. It's not a 24-hour news cycle. It is literally a 60-second news cycle. You know, the news is breaking all the time in so many different media. I think that does increase the tempo and make it harder for governments to make measured decisions. I mean, people, you know, for example, often a government will produce a report or a paper of some kind, and the media will be absolutely affronted if the opposition cannot give a comprehensive response immediately. And when you say things like, but actually we'd really like to read it and reflect on it, you get a sort of blank look. And of course what's going on in the bubble often in the journalist's head is, well, I've got no intention of reading it, so why would you? And there's a, you know, there is a lack of, I think there's a rush to judgment, and I think that's part of this pressure, this media pressure. I'm not demonising journalists. I mean, it's just a function of the technology as much as anything else. But I think that probably does create a more panicked attitude to government. So you should do a blog or an op-ed on that. It's a good point. The politics of panic. And Julia Gillard bowling alone. We've got two great topics here.
Okay, let's see if we've got a third.
John Bolderman from Sydney University, and should I say the other institution south of the city. My colleagues would never forgive me if I didn't ask you this question.
Yeah.
Maybe it's unfair, but to pose it in a less threatening way, what do you think might be the long-term future of nuclear power for Australia?
Yeah, well, I hope we do not keep nuclear power off the political agenda forever. I mean, it does generate 20% of the world's electricity, and in some countries much more than that. The track record of nuclear power has, you know, overall been, you know, very good in terms of safety. I mean, there's been there've been two notable disasters prior to the earthquake in Japan. Chernobyl, which was clearly human error, but in particular circumstances. You know, it was in the midst of a country, a regime that was literally collapsing around it.